Again, I like the cut of your jib.
Nobody has ever said that to me except for you, and now it's been twice.
Isn't it a great phrase?
It is. I like the cut of your jib.
I like the cut of your jib.
Thanks.
All right.
Okay.
So, Jan, thank you. Thanks for being on Between Two Fici. Ficuses.
It's my pleasure.
What would be the appropriate nomenclature for plural ficus plants?
Fici?
Fici?
Fici, yes.
Fici. What is your job?
I am the Associate Executive Presbyter for Ministry. So in most presbyteries, from what I understand, the executive presbyter oversees CPM and COM.
Yes.
That is not the case in Chicago.
Nice.
Which is my joy, because I have the best job in the presbytery.
Do you? What?
Absolutely.
Tell me precisely. Yeah, very precisely. Tell me so precisely you can barely even describe it in multiple sentences. What it means to be the staffer for COM and CPM.
Well, we have a little less than 100 churches, and we oversee all of the transitions. And in these days, everybody's in transition,
right,
even if they don't think they are.
Right.
So not just the transition of your pastor is retiring or going to another place, you're looking for a pastor, you wish you had a different pastor, the roof caves in, all of those things, but also the anxiety that comes with we're in a new day and the church is completely different than it was 50 years ago, and it's a new reformation. And so I think it's kind of a great time to be part of the church. In fact, I think it's an excellent time to be part of the church, but it's a lot of folks feel very anxious, including pastors. Some pastors do. And then we have people who are going through seminary who have never been in the church when it was, the roaring 50s or 60s, right, and everything was going well. So they're fine with coming in to do some interesting and curious things. There are a few people who expect to serve churches like the churches they grew up in, which were big, steeple, thriving churches. And there are those churches, of course, but not as many as there used to be. And we have a lot of people who want to go to specialized ministry. And I don't know if this is just our presbytery or others. We do have second career people under care. We have a lot of people who, if their second career lasted maybe 6 months between college and going to seminary.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. That was my experience.
Right.
I had a couple of different jobs and then went there. Well, speaking of those transitions, one of the big transitions that we have are a pastor, and oftentimes, at least in our neck of the woods, in the Synod of Mid-America, we're finding it's that long-time serving pastor who has now left, and the congregation is struggling with what do we do to replace her or him? How do we make sure that we get a new pastoral leader in that's going to help us be the church that God is calling us to be? One of the points that you have made, and you've made repeatedly, is that seminaries are training pastors to serve a church that doesn't really exist anymore. What do you mean when you have said that to people?
Sometimes pastors are come out into a church and they're planning to, if they just preach good sermons, if they offer good pastoral care, if they know how to moderate a meeting, and they have some chops in terms of budget planning and that kind of thing, that things are going to be okay, but there's so many other things that they need to know. That's just the kernel of the beginning. But a lot of it is being an entrepreneur. A lot of it is having an awareness of generational studies, multicultural studies, knowing how to read a neighborhood and read a community, knowing where to go to find not just demographics, but demographics that are beyond the usual census numbers. Who is here and where do they, what are they looking for? What would feed them? And really what breaks their heart? What if we don't know what breaks God's heart in a community, we're missing the boat. And I think a lot of pastors have been trained to be managers rather than disciple makers, for lack of a better word, or leaders in general. They don't know how to lead. And that's a terrible indictment, because there are great people in seminary and there are great professors in seminary, but I think that sometimes we're stuck. And I know that we have a couple of seminaries who are really into training people to do new church worshiping communities and that kind of thing. And that is very exciting to me, because we have so many different kinds of churches. There's really not one recipe that works in terms of, if you learn these things, you can be a really good pastor in almost every church. That's really not working anymore.
When you say the word entrepreneur, we need to have pastors who are entrepreneurs. There are going to be some people whose chests are going to start constricting and they won't breathe, and they may fall out of their chair and die right there. Because that's in some ways a very scary word, because it seems antithetical to who the church needs to be. And there's I think a legitimate critique about not being a capitalist business kind of thing. What do you mean when you say we need a pastor or a pastoral leader who is an entrepreneur?
Someone who's sort of got a startup frame of mind. We're going to try something and we're going to work really hard at it. It may not work, but we'll try it. And it could be a project that helps to bring in money for something. Not that it's a capitalistic money-making kind of thing. It would be a nonprofit still, but maybe there's some kind of thing we could partner with a business, or we could start something, a nonprofit organization or event or something that brings other streams of money in. We could partner with a community that needs affordable housing, let's say. And I know that there are a couple of places in the United States where they have sold part of their property and put mixed income housing, and so they've got a partnership where they're sharing that space maybe with someone else. Those kinds of things are very scary, because you're giving up a lot of the things. What do you mean we're not going to own our building? Or what do you mean we're not going to own all of our building? And so that's kind of scary for people. But I don't know. I think just having that creative spirit and not being afraid to take risks is really important for a 21st century pastor. So entrepreneur, forward-thinking leader, is a leader who understands that they can no longer sit back and just expect the pledges to come in. Absolutely. Expect the people to walk in. Right, exactly. That's right. You've got to get outside, or we've got to get outside the doors. My husband's church has this great stained glass window with the back of Jesus when you see it, and I love that, because that's exactly, we've got to everything starts when you leave the building, as opposed to everything begins when you enter the building. You've got to have a pastor, we've got to have a pastor that knows about the importance of having different entryways into a spiritual community. It can't just be that we spend all of our time on a great worship service and expect people to come in, and that's that. The most important hour of the week is increasingly not Sunday morning in terms of a church community's life together. And so we've got to call pastors who know how to do that. And that's not to say that Sunday morning or whenever you do worship is not important, but increasingly the church is every day wherever we are out in the world. When I was a pastor back in Virginia and working with Holy Grounds, which was a church that we nested in our traditional church, there was something every night. So there were different portals for entering the community. So somebody might come to worship Sunday night, and I would think they were new, but actually they've been coming to one of the other events for a year. And so that's just the different entry point depending on what their experience had been with churches. Maybe they have no experience with churches. Maybe they grew up in the church and their first portal into the community would be Sunday night. But chances are that wouldn't be the case.
You've mentioned needing to be aware of multicultural studies, generational studies. You had a list of things that you said. Why is that important? Why should we care about multiculturalism and generational theory, Jen? Why? Why? Isn't there only one culture and one generation present in the church?
People react to different things.
Yes.
And so you've got to be aware of it. Let's say you're recruiting officers. So I remember serving a church that had quite a few people who were in what's called the greatest generation. I might, as the pastor, ask them as a follow-up, because they said maybe they're thinking about it with the nominating committee, approaching them saying, we'd like you to consider serving as a ruling elder. And sometimes I would be the follow-up person. And with that generation, people would often say there's a sense of duty. Yes, I will do this because I don't really want to do it, but I have a sense of duty. Right. A millennial is not going to do that, generally speaking. Now, that's not to say that there aren't people that have a sense of duty, right. But it's very different. And people who do generation study, and this is not scientific at all, have said that there's about a 14, maybe 18% group in each generation that they're going to be outliers, and they're not going to be like everybody else. But generally speaking, if I asked a 26-year-old, are you interested in serving as a ruling elder? They're not going to have that same sense of duty, let's say, that a 70-year-old will have. Mm-hmm. So it's just being aware of generations. And in terms of being multicultural, I think that especially in urban churches, but not even in urban churches, I know that around Chicago, there are Spanish-speaking folks, Arabic-speaking folks who are living out in the suburbs increasingly. And so being aware of cultural differences is really important, because as we eventually certainly work together, shop together, right. Eat in diners together, mm-hmm. we will be worshiping increasingly together. Or that's my hope anyway, mm-hmm. because that's what the world looks like.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very important for Presbyterians specifically. Oh, yeah. We're 95%
right.
Anglo, white, right. whatever nomenclature we want to use.
Right.
And that's not the majority of the world.
That's right.
We do not reflect the world.
We do not at all. Mm-hmm. But increasingly though, I think what we offer is appealing to people who are not white. Mm-hmm. That may sound crazy because we are a very white denomination, but I think that the theology and the interest in learning and welcoming people is very appealing to all kinds of cultures.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we need a pastoral leader who is who's able to understand that, mm-hmm. that the church that once was is mm-hmm. no longer the church that we have. We need a pastor who understands the facets, mm-hmm. the beautiful facets, multiculturalism, mm-hmm. Generational theory, entrepreneurship, mm-hmm. all that is required. How do we find her? Mm-hmm. So we get this piece of paper that gets shoved in front of us. How can we determine that yes, she's the pastor we need, and not get fooled because everybody knows how to write a good resume, right? Everybody knows how to write a good
Well, not
resume.
Everybody.
Okay.
Some of them are really, really boring. They're really boring.
Hey, people, really.
Seriously, don't write a boring.
Can we give a class on this?
Absolutely.
Class on this?
Absolutely.
Coming soon. How to write a good pitch.
Seriously, because I know that especially when you've got a church that's seen as a plum church, because it's in an interesting place and the congregation is really interesting and they seem sort of ready to go. Uh-huh. A lot of people are going to be sending their PIFs there. And so some of these PIFs are just deadly boring. You're going to want somebody who's got kind of a spark. I think it comes through, although honestly, what looks good on paper is not necessarily what looks good in real life.
Yeah, how do we know she's the one if all we've got is the piece of paper?
Well, because if there's something about the piece of paper that really does spark you, we're a connectional system, so part of it is talking to whoever else knows this person.
Right.
That's huge. A lot of our churches certainly use the church leadership connection, but they also call people that they know. Who should we talk to? Mm-hmm. Who are the people who have the kind of gifts that we're looking for? Right. People call me about that all the time. I need somebody who is really going to be amazing and challenge us and push the boundaries a little bit.
Yeah, you and I have had a couple of those conversations.
That's right, we have. So I would say to look for that. Our new PIF, a new personal information form, I think gives opportunities to share, different kinds of things. The competencies are important and so forth. But when you have that conversation, it's so easy to go back to the things that we find comforting. Yeah. And so not to be afraid when we're looking at something that looks kind of a little bit different, like somebody's really interested in fighting human trafficking. Well, we've never even thought about that, but that is interesting to me, so I might want to talk with that person. So we want somebody who is not just going to have tunnel vision, but who has interests in connecting with the world and the community and so forth. But also, we've talked about this before, when a person does come, we're really attracted to people who are attractive. And by attractive, I mean they've had the right education, you know what I mean by that.
Yes.
They have the right friends, they have the right connections, they've served in the right churches and the right field education sites.
Right.
And they're pulpit candidate. candy. We don't want pulpit candy because honestly, I can't tell you how frustrating it is when you see something and you think you know what you're getting, but then the person starts and you didn't get the person you interviewed.
Right.
So it's checking those references for sure.
Yeah.
Having really a come to Jesus conversation and being honest as a committee too. You can't come across saying, "Oh yeah, we're totally ready to change," and you're not at all ready to change.
Right.
Or we're kind of terrified about what the future holds, but we're looking for somebody who will love us, who will be a good pastor for us, but also will help us push a little bit in directions that have scared us before.
Right. Yeah, it's a pretty standard. It's pretty commonly understood among pastors that you just don't believe the PNC. You just can't believe them because oftentimes they don't reflect the will of the congregation.
Right. And you've got to ask that. And I would really suggest too connecting with the COM of that church. I get calls all the time. This week I think I get 5 calls from people outside our presbytery wanting the real story on this church or that church.
Right.
And the real story is these are all wonderful people, but some of them are more ready to move than others.
Right.
Some of them have the capacity to do more than others for whatever reason. It's not just a money thing. It's an energy thing. And it's not even a generational thing. I've seen older congregations who have a lot of energy to make some changes. And I've seen, others that might be a little bit younger but aren't that interested really in change. They say, sure, we'd love to change and grow and reach out to the neighborhood, but they're not quite sure. Yeah. Or they don't know how to do it. So they need a leader who can teach them how to do it. It's one thing to say we equip the saints for ministry, and it's another thing to equip the saints for ministry. I know pastors who say, I want to empower you to go out and pray with our people or do a Bible study in Panera or whatever, but they don't have the beginning of a clue how to do it. So a strong 21st century pastor equips the saints, knows how to do that, knows, and it's an ongoing thing, knows how to teach people how to be ministers out in the world.
Yeah. Let's talk biblically for a second.
Okay.
I mean, if we could.
If we could.
Is that okay?
Absolutely.
Okay. I know we're Presbyterians. You've mentioned before, and you've encouraged when I've heard you speak about this before, to encourage people to think about the story of Samuel and David when talking about looking past this pulpit candy idea.
Right.
Tell us that story. Why is that a good understanding, a good narrative to center our understanding in?
David was the youngest son of Jesse.
We're talking about King David, right?
King David,
right.
Yeah. Well, he wasn't king yet because he's just the shepherd, the guy with the lyre. He's playing
Scrawny
the harp out in the woods. Yeah. He was the youngest. He wasn't even there for the beauty pageant that was the selection of the king, All the other brothers are coming in one by one. Yeah, this guy's got to be him because he's a big, brawny guy, and he's got probably a radio voice, and he's got a good-looking wife and really good hair. And
how are her lemon bars?
Excellent lemon bars, absolutely.
But she can't direct the children's choir.
No, she's not that musical, but that's okay because he's got a couple of kids also who can take it. Anyway, so there's David who has at this point no kids. We know how that was going to work out, but anyway, so he's out there. They haven't even invited him to the party, but he's the guy that is supposed to be their leader.
Yeah.
And so sometimes it's not the first person that you would imagine to be it could be the bald person. It could be the single mom. It could be, you're a predominantly white church. It could be a person of color. Right. I mean, it really depends. And so much of what your church is going to be is based on the quality of the leader. And it's not the way the person looks or the radio voice. It's really more, does this person have a vision to lead us into the next chapter?
Do you have a favorite question that you encourage folks to ask a candidate? Like my favorite question when I'm interviewing people, and it's worked in several different spheres, is tell me about the last time you royally screwed up and what you did with it.
Yeah, that's a really good question. That's a really, really good question. And that's one of my favorites as well. So you just kind of stole that from me.
Well, you are the queen of all things.
Oh yeah, I totally am.
I say, the first time I said it, as my friend Jan said.
Yeah, well,
the second time, a friend of mine said, and then the third time, as I've always said.
Exactly. Let me just see. So, there's a part of me that would say, so in the first 6 months that you're our pastor, what would you like to know that you don't now know?
Oh, good question.
Yeah. I love, one of my favorite things is a pastor who knows to connect with people who are not in the congregation.
Yeah.
I have a friend who serves a big church in a cute little town that is kind of perfect looking, brick sidewalks, and all the stores are really cute, and everybody looks really fun, and it's just a cute town. And she got together with the police chief and said, like, what do you do all day? What, because everybody looks like they're happy and smiling, and they're whistling and walking dogs and pushing strollers. And he said, well, actually, we have the highest domestic violence rate in the state, except for one other big city.
She never would have known.
She never would have known. So connecting with people, and they may think you're a little nuts because nobody's done that before, but to connect with the high school guidance counselor and just say, I'd like to pick your brain on, just tell me, like, what do you do all day? Like, what kind of kids are you working with? And I don't need names, obviously, but talk with the principal. Like, what rocks your world about this job, or what makes you crazy about this job, and to get an idea of who is in the neighborhood who's not currently with you in the church. And you can deploy your people you can train people to do that too. Our denomination has some really good resources. The Starting New Churches book has an exercise in it where you train your elders, let's say, or your deacons, any leaders. You go 2 by 2 and you sort of send them out to certain places with a checklist of who, they don't talk to each other, but just who's walking by, what language are they speaking, what kind of shoes are they wearing, where do they seem to be going, and to have it for different times of the week, different days. So, there's one couple of elders who go out on a Tuesday afternoon and just sit in their car looking to see who's at the playground in town. Or you have 2 people who go sit in a Starbucks on a Sunday morning at 11 o'clock and see who's in there.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
And those kinds of things, I think, are very appealing in terms of realizing, that's the only way you're really going to know who's out there and what do they need. So many times we have great ideas. An elder or a ruling or teaching elder will say, let's start a tutoring program. I think that I'd love to start a tutoring program. Let's do that. Let's start an ESL program. Let's start a preschool. Well, maybe the neighborhood doesn't need that because it's not about us. It's about what the needs of the community are.
Okay, so we've talked a little bit earlier about being entrepreneurial. We've just been talking about having a more missional focus, getting outside the walls, getting out there. There are a couple other things that you have consistently named as being important for a pastoral leader. The one that we need, maybe not the one that we want.
Right.
And one of those is adaptability.
Yes,
that's a word that you've used. But the church is the church, Jan, and has been forever and ever. Amen. What do you mean when you say adaptability in the life of the church?
Willing to try new things, and if they fail, they fail, and then you move on to something else, but you learn from that experience what didn't work. Adapting to the new people who might be coming in. That's a crazy thing. When people are terrified of new people coming in because they want their money, they want their presence, and maybe their children to be there, but they're not really wanting them to serve or introduce new music or share an opinion or bring not lemon bars but some kind of funky fig bar. I don't know, something completely different. And this has been going on for a really long time. This is not a new phenomenon. No. But to be flexible and to be able to make changes as changes are needed, but also to bring people along on those changes. Somebody who can teach adaptability. And really the core is, what is this about? Why does our church exist? Is it a club with a chaplain? Or are we here to reach out to the neighborhood to make disciples of all nations, to love God and our neighbor?
Right.
And so it's a theological thing. It really is. Even the clubs with chaplains are filled with really great people, but they've lost their mission. And invariably they have been part of churches that were very popular and very much thriving churches a while back. Right. And they're wondering what happened, what went wrong.
And that adaptability, that requires... Well, it requires a willingness to risk on the part of the pastor.
Yes, definitely.
How does a pastor, in your experience, where have you seen that it has worked, that a pastor has been able to transfer that willingness to risk to his pastoral leader or congregational leaders and the congregation as a whole?
Yeah.
How do you go about spreading the gospel of risk-taking?
Sure. First, you got to love your people so that you have the social capital. They know that you love them no matter what. Mm-hmm. And it's not a conditional love. You love them no matter what. They're your people that you've been called to serve. And then you've got to, I believe, appeal to their higher angels, because the three I've heard before, and I think this is an Esom and Bandy thing, the three key verses for a 21st century church are the Great Commission, go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and the Holy Spirit. One is from 1 Peter, feed my sheep. And think about the sheep come in all different shapes and sizes and colors. Right. And the other one is Ephesians 4, the pastor's job is to equip the saints for ministry. It's the only place in the Bible where there's a job description where that word is used, this pastor, when they're not talking about real shepherds with real sheep or Jesus as the great shepherd. And so I believe that people who gather in churches, and certainly those who have been there a long, long time and grown up in these churches, really do want to convey the love of Jesus Christ to other people. There are certain ways they've always done things, but I think if you love them and if you teach them that this is not something the pastor's coming in and dreaming up on his own or her own. This is biblical. This is, if you look at how Jesus reached out to people, Jesus very rarely parked himself someplace and said, you know, here I am, come find me. He was out there. Right. And so I think that it's returning to essentially a lot of the first century principles from the book of Acts. Yeah. And so it's, if we can convey to people that we really want them to be thriving churches, and we love them and will support them and feed them so that they can feed other people. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so they do this on all the TV shows. Okay. So like you know, the wrap up rapid fire kind of stuff. So succinctly, right?
Are you gonna give me a word and I have to tell you the first thing I think of?
Nice. If you were a tree, no. So if you could give a shorthand to a PNC, but for our COM and CPM folks. To help people, just a good shorthand, a good rubric for finding the pastor we need, not the pastor we want. What are the few things that they need to have in the front of their brain as they're looking through PIFs, as they're talking to candidates?
One of the first ones I think of is that your church is different from every other church. Good. So don't do what everybody else has done. Right. I sometimes go and do orientations with a PNC, and they will ask me for the finalists of the church down the street. They just called a pastor, and they would like their other finalists' names, so they can just cut to the chase and interview those people. Well, that's a completely different church with a completely different set of needs or hopes. Yeah. So don't worry about what other people do, and it has to be focused in prayer. And when I say focused, I mean it really, you know, God is going to tell you, and this is a terrible metaphor in a lot of ways, but it's like falling in love in some ways. It's like it makes no sense sometimes, but you kind of know. Yeah. And that's speaking in terms of intuition, but you just kind of know. And to be honest with yourselves about who you are as a church. Yeah. Because sometimes we would like to be a certain way, but we're really not, and that's okay. That's okay. You know, I talked with a guy yesterday who said, well, tell me about the kids at that church where I'm interviewing. I said, what kids? They don't have any kids. And he goes, well, their website shows pictures of kids. So I looked on the website, and they were the grandchildren of the retired pastor. It was his going away party. Oh. And yeah, there are no children. It's okay not to have, because every church is different. And so that scares me more when people try to be a church that they want to be. And because maybe God isn't calling you to be that church. It really is what God wants us to do and be.
That's good. That's good. This has been good, I think. I think that there's what I'm taking away from this is a willingness to be honest about a situation. This is the congregation we have. Right. These are our hopes. These are our fears. But this is who we are, and let's just be honest about that and find someone who is willing to love that about us. Yes. Right? Yes. Someone who is willing to help us be the best us that we can be. Right. Because really that's the dynamic. We often think about calling a pastor because she or he will be the ones to save us. No, it's how do we find someone who is going to help us be the best
That's
congregation
right.
we can be.
Absolutely. And it has to be about God. It can't be about this woman is looking for a job and she'll take anything she can find.
Right.
It can't be about that. And it can't be about, trying to impress the neighbors. We're going to call this really awesome pastor who's a terrible fit for us, but the Episcopalians down the street will be so impressed we got this person.
Yeah.
Who cares?
Yeah, really.
Yeah.
Yeah, who cares?
Right.
Well, thank you for joining me between two ficuses,
Phi-Sci. Yeah.
Plants,
welcome.
between two plants.
Thank you. I get no Brad Pitt questions? Come on. Really?
I'm not that good. I'm a horrible interviewer.
I disagree.
Terry Gross, I am not. That's a joke for a certain demographic, isn't it?
It is.
Well, we'd love to have you back on the show sometime.
Thank you so much.
Great.
I'd be delighted.
Okay, we'll see you next time.
Thank you.
On Between Two Ficuses. Okay.
I